to you. Good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning to you, and many more. Good morning, good morning, good morning, or good late afternoon to those of you who are watching. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Daring Dialogues. I'm your host today, Shantae Charles. I hope that you're having a great and wonderful day. Today we are back in our book on forgiveness because this is Thinking Thursday, Theology Thursday, where we cover matters of faith and philosophy. Um, but we have been working through this book entitled Failures of Forgiveness: What We Get Wrong and How to Do Better. We're going to start off. This is a new chapter, and it's talking about forgiveness as a political project. Now, we know that the United States is not ready for forgiveness as a political project yet because the United States is still in denial about what it has done to its citizens. So let's start there. So, her choice of political project that she's going to be talking about in this chapter is South Africa and the process that they went through. She may get to Germany in the Holocaust. I'm not sure yet, but I know she is starting this chapter off with the South African process. So, again, for those of you who are coming in, good morning and welcome. This is the book that we're reading. We are talking about the subject of forgiveness. And this is chapter 4, Forgiveness as a Political Project: Failures of Forgiveness, What We Get Wrong and How to Do Better, by Dr. Maisha Cherry. And unfortunately, every single morning I've got to either hide or remove people on YouTube who I guess are just not used to somebody having basic conversation on the internet. You would think by now that as long as YouTube has been out, that people would be used to regular conversation on the internet, but we're not quite there yet. So please come into the space, understand, maybe listen for a few minutes, see if this is something that you're interested in as a conversation. And if you are, stay tuned in. If you're not, find another channel. That's how this works, right? All right. Yeah, yeah. All right, another one bites the dust there. Forgiveness as political project. Between 1996 and 1998, the hearings on human rights violations held by the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, were broadcast on live television throughout the world. Now, I don't think I was watching television between 1996 and 1998, so I did not see this broadcast. But apparently, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission was being broadcast worldwide. The TRC had been created to address the political violence for and against apartheid that occurred between 1960 and 1994. The writer says, I was a teenager at the time and can still vividly recall the scenes that played on my old CRT television. Women wept as they described their experiences of violence and the need to find where their loved ones were buried. Now, I do remember watching when I was younger because 1995, I would have been 16 going on 17. So I was a teenager, during this time. But I do remember watching the film Serafina, if anybody's familiar with that film. And to me, that film kind of awakened me to oppression happening in other parts of the world. Um, and I could see the struggle of what was happening in the United States. I could see it through that film that some of the same things were happening in South Africa. And so that film, Serafina, actually, for me, opened my eyes to, oh, there's this kind of discrimination, violence happening in South Africa, and people are protesting, and people are being unalived for protesting, right? So she said that she was a teenager during that time as well. She said, I could feel their pain radiating from the screen. Beyond being shocked by the victims' testimonies, I was also inspired by their willingness to forgive and by the compassion of the commissioners in the wake of decades of hate and violence. I was not alone in my reaction. Almost 3 decades later, the forgiveness that victims extended and the reconciliatory work the committee was able to achieve continue to serve as a touchstone for the possibility of concord in a society marred by injustice and division. Calls by judges and journalists for Black victims of racial violence in America to forgive their attackers, and calls for a reckoning in the United States in the midst of deep political divides, particularly after the storming of the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, differ in important ways from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But given the success of the Commission in creating a new post apartheid South Africa, many think, or at least hope, that America could achieve similar results by emulating such a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Again, America is not in a state of truth or reconciliation right now. America is still in denial of any of its atrocities, while at the same time seeking to, in real time, erase any evidence of their atrocities. So I don't know if we will get to truth and reconciliation in even the next decade. It all really depends on who becomes our president. I won't say it all depends, but I will say a large part of it will play into who becomes our president in November, because one president is going to help finish the job of erasing Black American history, and the other president is not. It's really that simple, in terms of one of the aspects of why you should probably be getting out to vote if you're an American citizen who has the right to vote. All right. So, yes, people think that America could have good results by this kind of thing, but I don't think that our country is ready for it yet. Not that we shouldn't be ready by now, but we still are not ready for it. They just arrested literally 68 white supremacist gang members on yesterday in California, which is supposed to be one of the more liberal states. It was a wide ranging uh, undertaking, but they arrested 68 people. Yeah. So we're not quite there yet. The other thing, there's still unrest happening in South Africa. There are now, at this point, there is more sentiment starting to arise from the people who were displaced and who are now the impoverished or considered the impoverished versus those who are arising in South Africa. So even this commission that they had, I think current South Africans would probably tell a more nuanced story about what's happening in South Africa presently. She writes, there's a lot we can learn about forgiveness from the TRC. The TRC shows us what is necessary for wide scale forgiveness, but it also makes evident some of the problems with forgiveness as a political project. It shows how the model of forgiveness in our time falls far short from the ideal. An examination of the TRC reveals how far we can and must go in improving our societal practices of forgiveness. So let's look at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a brief history. The TRC is the most prominent large scale effort at engaging in political forgiveness in recent years. Created by the TRC Act of 1995, the Commission aimed, quote, to promote national unity and reconciliation in a spirit of understanding which transcends the conflicts and divisions of the past, quote, end quote. The Commission believed that only through reconciliation rather than vengeance could the nation transition to a post apartheid democratic South Africa. Victims were given the opportunity to tell their stories, and offenders were given the chance to tell the truth about the violent acts they committed, in exchange for which they would be granted amnesty. Now, I don't know about how Black Americans would feel about that. I don't know. So I'm going to admit to all the horrible things I've done in exchange for amnesty. Hmm, that's something that we would need to think on. This work was divided among three committees. First committee, the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. We know America's not even trying to think about that. Second committee, which provided support to victims through reparations. The second committee, the Amnesty Committee, which reviewed amnesty applications. So these are the people that would review the applications of the offenders who wanted to confess in exchange for amnesty. And then the third committee, Human Rights Violations Committee, which identified victims and investigated whether their human rights had been violated. Um, it would be interesting. It would definitely be interesting to see this kind of committee put forth in America because the documentation of the atrocities committed in this country are long and detailed. Some of them are hidden way, 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 way back, right? They're hidden way, way, way back in archives, buried under some things, shelved. But there are records because some of these plantation owners were so excited about inflicting abuse and harm. There's one plantation owner, I forget his name, but he would have detailed records of women that he was assaulting on the plantation and all that kind of stuff in journals. They're available. So it's not like we don't have records of who was doing what because some of these people were bold enough to record in detail the things that they were doing to enslaved persons. Here's what happened. Local churches throughout South Africa were charged with identifying victims from their region, taking initial statements, and sharing those statements with the HRV committee so that they could choose who would be allowed to testify at public hearings. Now, this would be another problem with the United States because the question then would be which churches would be taking these statements? Who would be making the decisions of whose testimony is allowed at a public hearing? The other question would be why only churches? Why not people who are in other um, religious streams? So that would definitely, especially in America, that would definitely need to go through a more thorough process of who would be identifying victims, taking their statements, and then who would be selecting the statements and the people allowed to testify at public hearings. More than 22,000 South Africans submitted statements to the TRC. 1,819 of them were selected to testify at the public hearings. So think about that. They got statements from 22,000 people, but less than 2,000 made it to the public hearing. I wonder what those records look like. They probably have them somewhere. That's crazy. Most of the testifiers were black. A small number of victims were white or colored, a racial minority in South Africa who have a mix of European and African or Asian ancestry. Victims were ordinary citizens, policemen, members of political groups. The victims did not testify about apartheid or even any and all acts of wrongdoing under apartheid. Instead, they testified to what were deemed gross human rights violations committed by state police, political parties, and anti apartheid groups. The HRV, chaired by Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who is now gone on, he's no longer here, a black South African native who was the Archbishop of Cape Town until 1996, held 5 to 15 depositions a day, with most hearings lasting less than an hour. Usually, the chair of the committee would open the hearing and introduce the witness, and then a committee member would lead the witness through their testimony. After a sharing of the details, the commissioners ritually asked them four questions. One, whether the TRC could do something to help the victim. Two, whether the victim would like to know the names of the perpetrators when applicable. Many victims knew fully well who their perpetrators were. Three, whether the victim was politically active at the time. And four, how the victim's life had been transformed by the events. In running these hearings, the commissioners had to determine how truth would be told and what counted as truth. These decisions, while difficult, paled in comparison to a much more difficult and controversial task to determine the appropriate link between truth telling and reconciliation. Not surprisingly, given the religious makeup of the committee, the high Anglican status of its chair, the Ubuntu philosophy, an ethical system that emphasizes community, equality, and shared humanity, and the Christianity of the majority of South Africans, they concluded that the link would be forgiveness. Isn't that interesting? Was the Commission's focus on forgiveness the only alternative? Perhaps not. For instance, they could have focused on love or an inclusion form of nationalism. However, reconciliation without forgiveness may have seemed less complete, an insufficient foundation for a post apartheid future. Given this, reconciliation required a discourse in which forgiveness was requested, encouraged, and praised. Oh, this is a hot mess. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is a hot mess. I just need to pause for a moment. During the first 6 months of the hearings, the committee asked each victim at the end of their testimony whether they had forgiven the perpetrator. Here are a few examples of the ways they talked about forgiveness in the victim hearings. Mrs. Pawpaw's husband was killed by a rival political group. Reverend Zundu, thank you, Mrs. Chairperson. Ma'am, I heard your story. I only have one question. According to you, what can be done so that there can be peace? Is there a conflict between yourself and this other group? Mrs. Papu, what I want is for them to come forward to tell the truth. Reverend Zundu, you are saying that reconciliation can be built if they can come forward? Mrs. Papu, yes, if they can come and tell the truth. Reverend Zundu, if they can come forward, will you forgive them? Mrs. Papu, yes. Reverend Zundu, thank you. Couldn't be me. Ooh, child. Mrs. Whitfield's husband was killed by an Azanian People's Liberation Army bombing in 1993. Here's hers. Mr. Sandi, I may be asking you the same question, but maybe in a different way. I don't seem to get your attitude too clear as to how you would relate to those who perpetrated this gross human rights violation. Let us suppose the people who did this to your husband and other victims of the tragedy were to come to you and say to you they are asking for forgiveness. How would you respond to such a request? Mrs. Whitfield, I've got no grudge against anybody. I feel if I have, then I cannot call myself a child of God, because if God forgives us, we can forgive others. Here on earth, there is no justice. Not something I would be saying. Here on earth, there is no justice. I've never seen justice in this world, but when he comes face to face with the Lord, that is the day he's going to get judged, and that is my only hope. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Y'all sat up here and had these people doing these kind of confessions and calling it truth and reconciliation. I got questions, South Africa. Now I got questions. I got questions. In both of these cases, the committee members were asked the victim whether, if certain conditions were met, they would be willing to forgive. By contrast, in other cases, committee members politely invited the victims to forgive. Did they invite the perpetrators to repent while they asking for forgiveness? This seems a bit one-sided here. Correct me if I'm wrong. All right, here's the third one. Miss Soboleo. The comrades and I met with other comrades from KTC, Yonga East, and Crossroads. We marched to indistinct wording, complain about the forced removals. Now, when you say the police shot you, was there anybody who told you that what you were doing was illegal? Nobody gave us any notice. The police just saw a crowd of people and they shot? Yes. I have several bullets in my body. Some are still in my female parts. Any other? Thank you very much, my sister. Please have forgiveness in you. We hope that you will be healed spiritually and physically. Thank you. Oh, see, this is a whole mess. Now I got questions about this truth and reconciliation that went down in South Africa. Because if this is what they were doing, and it was guided by this westernized version of forgiveness through the church, and all these people's witness testimonies had to go through this kind of religious process, and asking victims to offer forgiveness, this is a whole mess. Somebody from South Africa need to talk to me about this. I need to know why what was this? Because why what? Okay, last section for today. What forgiveness can do. In his book No Future Without Forgiveness, Bishop Tutu details two benefits of the TRC's use of forgiveness rhetoric. First, he argues that requesting forgiveness served as a direct and explicit means towards reconciliation. For Tutu, asking for forgiveness was a way of staring truth in the face and a way to work out why they, offender and victim, fell out in the first place. That is to say, in their responses to the question whether they would forgive, participants had to make explicit what many of them would otherwise have left unsaid. What human rights violations had occurred and what was needed to achieve reconciliation could not be glossed over. Participants were forced to strive for actual peace rather than merely peace in appearance. Another benefit of these requests is that it made evident the value of forgiveness. As Tutu notes, asking for forgiveness and getting a negative response demonstrated that forgiveness could not be taken for granted. It was neither cheap nor easy. The request and its refusal showed that forgiveness took work. The focus on forgiveness has some other desirable features that are worth noting. Beyond the physical harm imposed by rights violations, such victimization also robs people of autonomy, but there's a way in which forgiveness requests can provide victims with opportunities to reassert their power publicly by placing them in the role of the decision maker. The choice to forgive can empower victims by allowing them to choose healing, differentiating themselves from the people who attacked them. I believe the TRC did, in fact, provide this kind of empowerment. By asking victims to forgive, the TRC gave victims the opportunity to exert their autonomy on a public stage. Importantly, both those who decided to forgive as well as those who refused the request, which probably would have been me, were given a public space to make or declare their decision. And that act of choosing was empowering. The benefit here has less to do with the value of forgiveness and more to do with the value of choice. If a society is to heal and continue to exist after violence, it is not enough that victims and offenders coexist. Victims must regain a sense of personal and civic power over their lives. I'm sorry, but I still think that this is, um, I still think that this is, especially if this was done like on a national public live setting, I still feel like asking these people to forgive in that moment of questioning was still performative. It's still putting person on the spot, a national spot, as to whether or not they will forgive. So I don't know. I have mixed thoughts about this process. Even without the request and invitation to forgive, it is likely that some, perhaps many victims would have forgiven those who had harmed them. Some victims were Christian, and the Christian scriptures encourage forgiveness. These victims might have felt compelled by their religious convictions and might not have needed the committee to encourage them to forgive. My question is, why is the committee encouraging them to forgive? Why isn't the committee encouraging um, restoration without calling on the people to forgive? I think, to me, I think forgiveness is something that should be decided upon with that person in that person's time. So I hope that their reparations was not contingent upon them forgiving. Like, I hope that that part of this Truth and Reconciliation Committee, I hope they didn't hold back from trying to repair people if they were not in a space yet or at that time to forgive. However, there is no doubt that the committee was successful in spreading the public message that forgiveness was important for a new South Africa. Moreover, forgiveness discourse helped open up the possibility for forgiveness. The committee's rhetoric was expressed within a context of truth, facts about the atrocities, and acknowledgement, recognition of those facts. The committee was trying to get at the truth of what had occurred. They were also acknowledging the pain and hurt of the victims. Now, what if you're the victim that says, clearly you can't be acknowledging my pain and my hurt because you are asking me to forgive, and I'm not ready for that? What about that victim? Those are the people I kind of wonder about in this setting. It was this truth and acknowledgement that made it more possible for victims to want to forgive. Sindiswa Poncho, or Sindiswa Muhanto, a black South African interviewed by the Cape Times in 1996, noted this: I want the TRC to search for truth. You cannot forgive something you don't know. Sandiswa recognized that in order to forgive, a person must have something and someone to forgive. This can only occur by getting at the truth, so truth is a necessary precondition for forgiveness. The forgiveness requests by the committee were successful in part because they took place after the victims gave their testimony. More importantly, the same committee that was making the request was also investigating the human rights violations. The committee was also part of a commission whose task was to uncover crimes through confessions made at the concurrent amnesty hearings. Even though the forgiveness requests did not in themselves provide truth, they were made in a context of finding the truth. By working to find something that victims could forgive, the committee opened up the possibility that victims could forgive. Forgiveness was also made possible by the acknowledgement the requesters gave to victims. Acknowledgement, according to the committee, was an affirmation that a person's pain is real and worthy of attention, thus central to the restoration of the dignity of victims. The committee acknowledged those who were once silenced by recording their testimonies in public record. They also showed compassion and empathy. In many cases, Bishop Tutu wept with the victims. And when testifiers such as Namande Kalata, the wife of an activist who was killed by police officers at a roadblock, filled the hearing with a wailing cry, the committee led the audience in a moment of silence or a freedom song. Requests made in this kind of context create conditions for victims to consider forgiveness in the future. The TRC shows some of the benefits of forgiveness talk. as part of the political project of repair. It is an example of how forgiveness discourse can both empower victims and open up the possibility for forgiveness to take place. These benefits are achieved only when requesters truly desire peace, let the silence speak, extend empathy and compassion, dedicate themselves to seeking truth, and acknowledge victims. It doesn't happen by simply talking about forgiveness as if it's some magic word. For any community or nation interested in reconciliatory work, they must keep in mind that it's not enough that we encourage and request forgiveness. We must also seek the proper conditions that allow for it to take place. Now, the next section is going to talk about what is called a false choice and what I feel happened in this case, forced to forgive. How did these people how did these people really feel? Because some of this feels forced when you are doing a public hearing testimony being shown to the world and you're being asked and put on the spot, are you going to forgive this person? So we will look at that on next Thursday. All right. If you're watching by YouTube, I want to thank you for your time and attention. Please tell me your thoughts about this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Do you think that looking at what South Africa is and the things South Africa is going on and going through today, do you feel like this Truth and Reconciliation Commission was successful in its goals? If you're from South Africa and you're watching this video, please comment in the comment section once this video posts because I really truly want to understand, how do contemporary South Africans feel now? We're what, almost 30 years into since they started this? How do you all feel now about the work that was done? And do you think it was enough? All right. We're continuing this conversation over on Instagram at Daring Dialogues is where we are. You can join us there for the talkbacks. Until next time, be well, and most importantly, be light.